Montana Territory, July 1882. She crossed the river in tattered shoes, the cold water biting at her ankles, skirts heavy with mud and fear. The sky was thick with dusk, clouds stretched wide like bruises across the horizon. Her breath came in sharp gasps, not just from the cold, but from the ache in her ribs and the weight of everything she had left behind. Harriet Vaughn did not stop to look back. There was nothing left on the other side of the river but an empty cabin, a man with cruel eyes, and two small graves beneath a crooked pine. Her feet hit dry land, and she collapsed to her knees, trembling and soaked. She pressed a hand to her belly, not from pain, but from habit. No baby there anymore. Just the memory. Up the bank, a horse snorted. She jerked her head up. A man sat tall in the saddle, reins loose in one hand, rifle resting across his lap. He looked down at her without moving, like he had been waiting there all along. "You hurt?" he asked. His voice was deep, steady. His face was tanned and wind-cut, with dark blonde hair curling at the ends and a scar beneath one eye that did not make him look cruel, just real. Harriet blinked at him. "No. I just need to keep going." "You already crossed the river in those shoes," he said. "You are not going anywhere else tonight." She looked at her feet. The leather was cracked and soaked straight through. Her toes had gone numb. "I do not have anything," she said. "No money. No name worth giving." The man swung down from his horse. "I am not looking for either." She watched as he unfastened his coat and held it out to her. She hesitated. He waited. Harriet took it. He nodded once. "Name is Thatcher Hollis. My land is up the trail." "You are safe now." She did not believe in safety. Not anymore. But something about the way he said it made her nod. He helped her onto the horse, his hands warm and careful on her waist. She did not flinch. That surprised her. They rode in silence up a narrow trail that twisted between tall firs and rocky hills. The air smelled of pine and wood smoke. At the top of a low rise, Thatcher's cabin came into view, small, solid, with light in the window and smoke curling from the chimney. She did not realize she had gone quiet until he said, "You got a name?" "Harriet," she said. "Harriet Vaughn." He gave a small nod, like he would remember it. Inside, the cabin was warm and plain. A single room with a stove, a bed, a table, and a worn rug. He handed her a blanket and turned his back while she changed into one of his old shirts, long enough to cover her knees. Her dress, soaked and torn, lay in a heap by the door. Thatcher stirred something on the stove. "You hungry?" She nodded. He passed her a bowl of beans and cornbread. She ate slowly, her hands shaking. He watched her, not in the way men used to look at her, but like he was trying to figure out what she needed. That unsettled her more than anything. "You running from someone?" he asked quietly. She froze, spoon halfway to her mouth. He held up a hand. "You do not need to tell me. Just figured if someone comes looking, I should be ready." She swallowed hard. "No one is coming." His eyes held hers for a long moment. Then he nodded. That night, she lay on the bed while he took the floor. She stared at the ceiling, her body warm for the first time in days. Still, she did not sleep. In the morning, she found him outside chopping wood, sweat shining on his arms. He handed her a tin cup of coffee without a word. She drank it in the sunlight, her fingers wrapped tight around the warmth. Days passed slow and quiet. Harriet helped where she could, sweeping the floor, tending the fire, mending shirts. Thatcher never asked questions, never pressed. He just made space, like she belonged. One afternoon, as they shelled peas on the porch, she asked, "Why did you stop when you saw me by the river?" He did not look up. "Because you looked like you needed someone." Her throat tightened. "You do not even know me," she said. He turned to her then. "I know enough." The silence between them settled soft, not heavy. She looked out at the hills, the river she had crossed now just a sliver of blue in the distance. "Those graves," she said, voice raw. "Back where I came from. They were my children." His hand stilled on the bowl. He did not speak, but she felt the air shift. "I was 17 when I married." He was older. Mean. The babies were small. They did not make it through last winter. Thatcher's jaw tightened. "I am sorry." She nodded, blinking hard. "I did not mean to say that out loud." "You needed to," he said. She looked at him, really looked. Thatcher was not a man who filled silence for the sake of it. He just stayed. Steady. Present. And for the first time in a long time, she felt like maybe she could stay too. That night, she stood outside the cabin, watching the stars blink into the dark. Thatcher came to stand beside her. "I have not let anyone touch me in over 2 years," she said quietly. I will not touch you unless you ask me to, he said. Her eyes filled. She turned to him. I am not broken, she said. Just worn thin. He stepped closer. Then let me help you build back. She reached up, touched his face. He leaned into her hand, gently, like it meant something. And in that soft, quiet moment, under the stars in the wide Montana sky, she started to believe that maybe, just maybe, a hopeful future was possible. The first frost came early that year, curling over the grass like breath held too long. Harriet stood at the edge of the garden plot, her hands deep in the soil, pulling the last of the carrots. The earth was cold, but not frozen, not yet. Beside her, a basket sat half full, its weave frayed in places. She'd repaired it the day before with twine and quiet determination. Thatcher was in the shed, oiling the harness straps before the snow settled in. He worked with the door open, light spilling onto the packed dirt floor. The scent of linseed oil drifted soft on the breeze. From time to time, she heard the creak of leather, the faint scrape of his knife across a rough edge. Do you want to try tilling an ash before the ground sets? She asked, not raising her voice. He stepped out, wiping his hands on a cloth. Best do it now. I'll fetch the bucket. They worked shoulder to shoulder, scattering the cooled ash from the stove into the soil. It clung to her skirts in gray streaks, dusted her sleeves like memory. When they finished, she leaned on the shovel, watching crows wheel above the distant hills. You always did this alone before? She asked. For years, Thatcher said. Not sure why I kept planting more than I needed. She didn't answer. He wasn't asking for one. That night, she sat on the floor with a spool of thread and a wool shirt with a torn cuff. Her needle moved slow, precise. Thatcher read by lantern light, one boot off, foot resting on the rung of a chair. You ever lived in a town? She asked without looking up. He turned a page. Once. Worked in a smithy out in Helena when I was younger. Didn't suit me. Too many people. Too little quiet. She nodded, tying off her thread. I was raised outside of Emporia. My father was a cooper. He liked things neat. Measured. If I set a cup down crooked, he'd write it without a word. He closed the book. You close with him? I don't think you knew how to be close with anyone. Her voice was even. He died before I turned 16. We never talked much. Thatcher didn't fill the silence. She liked that about him. The next morning, she found a pair of leather boots by the hearth, clean but worn soft at the toes. They weren't hers. She stood staring at them until his voice came from behind. They'll fit. I had a sister once. Feet weren't much different than yours. She turned. Where is she now? Buried near the bitterroots. Fever took her when she was 20. Harriet stepped into the boots. They hugged her feet like they remembered someone else. Later, while gathering kindling near the woodshed, she spotted a canvas bag tucked behind the stack. Inside were folded linens, a tin of dried apples, a thick braid of garlic, and a soapstone carving shaped like a bird. She brought it inside, holding it up in question. Stored that for winter trade, Thatcher said. But I figured you'd use it sooner. She set the carving down gently. You always keep things this quietly generous? He shrugged one shoulder. Just seemed right. That evening, a snow flurry dusted the porch. Harriet lit a second lamp without asking. The flame caught her face in profile, soft and serious. Thatcher watched her from the table, where he was mending a saddle strap. I've been thinking, she said, voice low. If I stay through the winter, I should do more than cook and sweep. He set the strap aside. You already do plenty. I want to learn how to trap rabbits. He blinked. You sure? I want to know how to feed myself if I have to. Thatcher nodded slowly. I'll show you come morning. Snow's not deep yet. She exhaled in relief, then smiled before catching herself. He didn't miss it. You ever hunted before? He asked. Once. My husband made me bring down a quail with a slingshot. Laughed when I cried after. Thatcher's jaw worked, but he said nothing. I won't cry this time, she added. I don't care if you do, he said. You still have the right to try. The wind pressed against the window panes, soft and distant. Inside, the silence between them warmed. That night, she lay in bed and stared at the ceiling, fingers curled into the quilt. From the floor, his voice came quiet, steady. You don't have to be afraid of becoming yourself here. She didn't answer, but her eyes filled. When she finally slept, it was without waking. By late November, the snow had begun to stay. It clung to the eaves and softened the edges of the world, muffling sound and slowing every step. Harriet adjusted her gait to the drifts without complaint, her breath rising in pale plumes as she followed Thatcher's tracks into the woods. He walked ahead, rabbit traps balanced in a sling across his back, the morning quiet except for the hush of snow underfoot. When he paused, she did too, watching as he knelt beside a narrow set of prints that veered toward a stand of spruce. "See how the stride shortens here?" he asked without turning. "That's where it started to dig." She crouched beside him, her knees stiff from the cold. "It's not fresh," she said. "Edges are soft." He glanced over, eyebrows lifting slightly. "You're catching on." They set the traps near a line of brush where the ground dipped, the bait tucked beneath twigs to keep it dry. Harriet worked without needing him to repeat instructions. Her hands had steadied over the past weeks, not just from practice, but from something quieter, a kind of peace that came from being needed without being used. Back at the cabin, she peeled off her gloves and set water to boil. Thatcher stacked firewood by the stove, his shoulders dusted with snow. He'd stopped asking if she was warm enough. She always found the hearth before the chill reached her bones. "You ever think about leaving Montana?" she asked as she sliced dried onions into the pot. He shook out his coat near the door. "Once or twice, but nowhere else ever called loud enough." She stirred the pot. "I used to dream about Chicago, all those buildings and gas lamps. But now I think I'd miss the quiet too much." He leaned against the doorway, arms crossed. "You'd last a week before you were looking for pine trees again." She smiled, just a little. Maybe less. After supper, she took out the small carving he'd given her weeks ago and set it on the table between them. The bird's wings were spread mid-flight, its beak open as if singing. "What kind of bird is it?" she asked. "Swallow," he said. "They return to the same place every spring, no matter how far they go." She ran her thumb along the smooth curve of its back. "That's a nice thought." He didn't answer, but his gaze lingered on her face longer than it had before. That night, the wind rose sharp against the walls. Harriet bundled herself into her quilt and listened to the rafters creak. Across the room, Thatcher shifted beneath his blanket, then stood and added a log to the stove. The firelight lit the edges of his face, catching the gold in his hair. She sat up slowly. "You don't sleep much, do you?" He looked over. "Not when the wind sounds like it's trying to come in." She patted the space beside her. "You don't have to keep pretending you're not cold." He hesitated, then crossed the room. The mattress dipped beneath his weight as he lay beside her, careful not to touch. She turned toward him, as adjusting to the dark. "I didn't think I'd ever let someone near me again," she said softly. "You didn't let me," he murmured. "You chose to." Their fingers found each other beneath the covers, slow and deliberate. No rush, no hunger, just the weight of trust, settled and steady. She closed her eyes and breathed him in, the scent of cedar and iron and something warm she hadn't named yet. Come morning, the storm had passed. The snow outside was smooth and untouched, the sky pale with the promise of sun. Harriet stood at the window, watching the light shift across the hills. Behind her, Thatcher poured cornmeal into a pan, the scent of lard crisping in the skillet. Without turning, she said, "I'd like to stay." He didn't speak for a moment. Then, quiet as a prayer, "Then stay." She turned, the light catching her face. "Not just for winter. I mean, for good." He set the spoon down, walked to her, took her hands. "I was hoping you'd say that," he said. And when he kissed her, it wasn't sudden or sweeping. It was slow, sure, and just right, like a door opening the rest of the way after standing ajar for too long. Outside, a swallow darted across the snow-blue sky. The days settled into a rhythm as the year turned. Snow deepened until it muffled the world, and the cabin became a small, warm island in a sea of white. Harriet learned the subtle language of winter, how birch bark burned hotter than pine, how to feel for ice beneath powder, how the hush of snowfall at dusk could make the air feel holy. She had not expected quiet to feel like strength, but it did. One morning, she stood barefoot on the cabin floor, sleeves rolled to her elbows, shaping dough for biscuits. The chill still clung to the window panes, but the stove glowed steady. Thatcher sat at the table, sharpening a blade against a whetstone, his hands moving slow and sure. "I'd like to keep a few hens come spring," she said as she pressed her knuckles into the dough. "Not many, just enough for eggs." Thatcher didn't look up. "There's a cedar frame behind the shed. Was my sister's coop. Needs tar and wire, but the bones are good." She glanced at him, brow lifting. "You've had it sitting out there all this time?" "Didn't have a reason to fix it before." She folded the dough, dusted her hands with flour. "I'll mend the frame if you handle the wire." "That's fair." They didn't speak again until the biscuits browned. When the meal was done and dishes rinsed, Thatcher reached for his coat. "I'm riding down to the glen. Elk moved through last night, judging by the tracks. Harriet dried her hands on her apron. I'll come. He paused, then nodded. It's about 5 miles. You sure? I've been inside too long. They rode out under a pewter sky, the horses breath fogging in the cold. The path narrowed as they moved through the trees, hooves crunching over frozen needles. The silence between them didn't stretch it fit. At the glen, they dismounted and moved on foot. Harriet crouched low beside a cluster of tracks, trailing her fingers through one. 3 of them, she said. Big. Maybe bulls. Thatcher joined her, scanning the ground. You're right. The lead stepped wide. They followed the trail until it vanished into a frozen creek. Harriet stopped, eyes narrowing at something half buried in the snow. She knelt, brushed the powder away. A rusted horseshoe, pitted with age, lay there. No tracks nearby. Thatcher moved beside her. Old cavalry shoe. Probably dropped years back. That trail used to run mail during the war. She turned it over in her hands. Funny how things stay behind, like they're waiting to be found. He studied her face a moment. Some things are worth finding. She slipped the horseshoe into her saddlebag. They didn't speak on the ride back. That evening, Harriet stitched a new patch onto Thatcher's winter coat, her needle slipping through the heavy cloth with effort. He sat across from her, carving a length of dry pine into a spoon, wood shavings curling at his feet. I thought about teaching, she said, not looking up. Back before I married. There was a woman in Emporia, Miss Teague, who ran a school out of her parlor. She let me help with letters sometimes. Thatcher set the carving aside. You ever wish you'd done it? I used to, she said. But I think I wanted it mostly because it felt like a way out. She tied off her thread and met his gaze. I don't feel caged anymore. He didn't smile, but the corners of his eyes softened. You've changed since you crossed the river. She folded the coat, her hands stilling. I had to. No, he said. You chose to. Later, as the fire burned low and the wind scraped across the roof, Harriet stood barefoot on the hearthstones, fingers trailing along the mantel. The horseshoe rested there now, cleaned and dark against the wood. Thatcher approached, slow. He didn't reach for her, just stood beside her, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. You see that as luck? He asked, nodding toward the iron curve. I see it as proof, she said, that something left behind can still be carried forward. He turned toward her. And if I asked you to marry me, would that feel like carrying forward? She looked at him, eyes clear and steady. I'd say yes. He exhaled, the sound low and full. Then I'm asking, he said. She reached for him, fingers warm as they threaded through his. Then I'm yours. Outside, the snow began to fall again, soft and slow as breath. Inside, the hush that followed was full of everything they'd built: quiet truths, steady hands, and a promise that had been earned one day at a time. The thaw came slow, creeping out from the edges of the woods and down through the gullies where the snow melted first. I slid from the branches in long sighs, and the creek that had been silent for months began to murmur again. Harriet stood in the doorway, apron tied around her waist, watching the runoff trickle past the edge of the garden plot. The ground was still hard beneath the surface, but the scent of damp earth had returned. She leaned her shoulder against the frame, one hand resting just above her hip, and breathed it in. Inside, Thatcher was bent over a sheet of rough-hewn pine, sanding its edge with quiet focus. He'd started building a cradle 3 days ago, after Harriet had taken his hand and placed it flat over her belly without a word. He hadn't said much then, just looked at her with something deep and steady in his eyes, and nodded once. Since then, the wood shavings had gathered thick around his boots. I think I'll plant barley, Harriet said, her voice carrying easily through the open door. Not much of it, just enough to try my hand. Thatcher didn't look up. You'll want the far end of the plot. Drainage is better there. She stepped back inside and knelt to fasten the latch on the window. I'll need to figure out how to keep the elk out. Your garden fence won't hold if they come hungry. I can rig a second line above the rails, he said. Use scrap tin to rattle when they press against it. She nodded slowly. You always think ahead. He set the sandpaper down and met her gaze. I didn't used to. Harriet crossed the floor and traced the edge of the cradle with her fingers. The wood was still raw, but the shape had begun to emerge round its sides, smooth corners, a steady curve like the hull of a boat. You think we'll be ready? She asked softly. Thatcher set his hands beside hers. We already are. As the days lengthened, they worked in quiet tandem. Harriet hauled stone from the creek to line the garden rows, her fingers red from the cold water. Thatcher repaired the coop's roof with tar-soaked canvas, his shoulders dusted with sawdust and sun. They spoke less now, but not from lack of things to say. It was a different kind of silence, full, settled, like the slow rise of bread in the oven. At night, they lay close without needing to fill the dark. Her head rested just below his collarbone, and his hand curved around the back of her neck, thumb moving slow in the soft space beneath her hairline. One morning in late March, they made the long trip into town. Harriet rode behind him, wrapped in her wool cloak, her hands clasped beneath his coat. The trail had dried in places, but was still slick with mud where the trees pressed close. They traded for salt, nails, and a length of calico. At the dry goods store, the shopkeeper's wife offered Harriet a bolt of muslin for the baby's swaddling. "You'll want something soft for a spring, babe," she said gently, folding the cloth into neat squares. Harriet held the fabric to her cheek, then nodded. "We'll take it." Thatcher paid without a word, his hand brushing hers as he passed her the wrapped parcel. Outside, the wind carried the scent of tannin and fresh hay. Harriet tucked the muslin into her satchel and turned to him. "I never thought I'd want to come back to a town." He adjusted the saddlebag. "You didn't come back to it. You came through it." They returned home by twilight, lanterns swinging from the saddle horn. The cabin rose into view just as the stars began to prick the sky. That night, Harriet stood barefoot on the rug, brushing her hair in long, even strokes. Thatcher watched her from the bed, one arm propped behind his head. The light caught her in profile, rounded belly, chin lifted, eyes quiet and clear. "Would you have married again?" she asked, "if I hadn't come across that river?" He didn't answer right away. "Then, I never saw anyone I wanted to build a life with. Until you." She set the brush down and came to sit beside him. "You never asked me how I lost them." Thatcher took her hand gently. "You told me what you needed to. I think I can tell the rest now." She spoke slowly, words careful but unflinching. He listened, never interrupting, never looking away. When she finished, he pulled her close and kissed her temple, his breath warm against her skin. "You won't be alone for any part of this," he said. By mid-April, the cradle was finished, lined with muslin and trimmed with a strip of her late mother's linen. The barley had sprouted in faint green rows, and the hens had begun to lay. Harriet moved slower now, but with purpose. Thatcher never strayed far, always within reach if she needed him. The birth came in the quiet hours before dawn, just as a soft rain began to fall. Thatcher lit the lamp and held her hand as the pain crested and broke again and again. She bore it with grit and silence, eyes locked on his. When the cry finally came, it was thin and reedy and full of life. Thatcher wrapped the child in the muslin and placed her in Harriet's arms. The baby blinked slowly, mouth working against the air. "She's strong," Harriet whispered. "She's everything," Thatcher said. They named her Eliza, after his sister. That spring, the cabin grew fuller. Not louder, just more alive. The cries of the baby gave way to coos, the garden thickened with green, and laughter returned, soft and unforced. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the ridge, Harriet stood in the doorway with Eliza against her shoulder. The child's breath warmed her neck, and her tiny fingers clutched a fold of her mother's dress. Thatcher came up behind them, wrapping his arms around them both. They watched the light fade, the world settling into dusk. "I never thought I'd be part of something that lasts," Harriet said. "You are," Thatcher said. "And so am I." They stayed there until the stars came out, and even then, they lingered, the three of them warmed by the steady fire within and the quiet certainty that they had built something that would hold strong as pine, soft as muslin, and rooted deep in the earth they now called home.